roughly 15 years now of experience that I have in the area of game preservation. And the slides here will kind of walk you through things. My intention is to go through a bunch of topics about what I've been doing the last 15 years. I'm going to start by giving you a little bit of background, just very quickly, some of the things that I've been involved with at Stanford. The collections I've been involved with at Stanford since the mid-1980s include the Silicon Valley Archives and several game collections that we've acquired. Also some online collections that I've been involved with, including the Machinima Archives and the Preserving Virtual Worlds collection. I'm going to be talking in particular about the Preserving Virtual Worlds project as I get into this. So the way this is going to go is I'm going to talk about these projects, and I'm going to start with the foundation for all of the game-related collections, which is the Cabernetti collection. This is a collection we acquired in 1998. Essentially, I've been working by 98 at Stanford. The Silicon Valley Archives was pretty well established. It had been a going operation for a dozen years or so. We'd acquired a bunch of collections. We had a fairly strong presence in the area of technology archives, sort of regional development, all the kinds of topics you would associate with Silicon Valley. Something like 75 platforms and many publications. The collection as a whole is about 800 linear feet, if that means something to you as an archivist. So it's a fairly big collection. Just to give you sort of an idea, this is the record and the catalog for the Cabernetti collection. You'll see there sort of the extent of the collection and all of that. It says there 1,375 linear feet. I'm not sure where that number comes from. I think it's a little high, but it's possible that that includes some of the hardware that we have not yet cataloged. So again, it's a fairly gigantic collection. We'd move from there to paging the box, and you'll get this game, Road to Moscow. Now, one thing I'd point out as you look at this, the items in the collection came to us almost entirely in pristine condition. So that means in the original boxes, usually still in shrink wrap. Keep that thought in mind as I'll be coming back to it later when I talk about some of the things we're able to do in terms of software preservation. Again, because this is pretty much pristine the way it came to us, we get the software, you see the floppies there, but we also get all the inserts, manuals, cards that you were supposed to send in. It's really a pretty amazing collection in that respect, and you can imagine this is true for all the different platforms that we have represented in the collection. These inserts are important because unlike the kind of attitude we have towards software today, back in the 1980s, 1970s, 1980s, there was a lot of paper-based documentation inside software, including games. So there's a lot of information about things like interfaces, how people played games. And in fact, to date, this collection has been used more for the paper documentation inside the boxes than to actually run the software in the collection. People who, the kinds of projects we've had people come into the collection with has involved more trying to understand how people were introduced to software and trying to understand the different interfaces and such that were available to software users at the time. And the reason I chose this one, again, you know, it's a box, pristine and all that. You open it up, and sometimes you find surprises, like audio cassettes. And this is a reminder that with a collection that begins in the 1970s, we are going to be dealing with many formats that are difficult to use today, and in many cases are even forgotten. I don't know how many of you remember working with, you know, if you were even using computers 30 years ago, if you're using a home computer, very often the software came not in a random access kind of storage device, but on an audio cassette, a data cassette they were called. Of course, I'll be getting back to these problems as I talk about some of our projects. So, moving on to the second topic, I said I would talk about some of the goals that emerged out of receiving this collection. What happened was the collection came in '98. A year or two later, a member of the history faculty, Tim Lenoir, approached me about joining forces and creating a project at Stanford that would be devoted about half to the history of digital games and simulations, and about half to archives and preservation activities. And I had a pretty extensive background in commercial war games and simulations of that sort. So we decided to do some writing, which we did around the interesting history of military simulation in the United States, and at the same time, several of our initial archival collections were in this area. Things like the archive of the 73 Easting simulation from the first Gulf War, or the America's Army game. 73 Easting simulation, which was put together on the basis of, on top of something that was called SimNet, that was developed in the late 1980s and was pretty much ready to go by the early 1990s, and was available at the time of the first Gulf War. The Battle of 73 Easting was the biggest engagement of that conflict. These are some. We also created a larger project on the basis of this early work on simulation, and started branching out more into areas like exhibitions. We did probably the first exhibition on game art in the United States at the Yerba Buena Center in 2003. Another exhibition on storytelling and role-playing games at the Cantor Center in 2003 and 2004, and a number of other things. This is what you're looking at right now is the more current website for the How They Got Game project, which indicates if you go to that site, howtheygotgame.stanford.edu, you can read up about the various projects we have tried over the years. We did collect a little bit of hardware, or at least we were given hardware. This is what you're looking at there, for example, is the equivalent in 1991, 92 of a video card of the type that the military used. So it's a graphics generator that was used for the simulation. Unfortunately, we were not able to save this artifact, but we were able to photo document it. Again, I'm sure many of you know how to use finding aids, but here I'm just trying to give you an idea of the kinds of materials that we've collected. A lot of this is the media that was brought together to construct this this simulation. Again, just to give you another idea of the kinds of stuff that comes together in a collection like this. Tables, data tables. Interesting thing is if you really, with any kind of game documentation or simulation documentation, one of the difficult things is to gather information about how the artifacts were actually created, how the software was created. And in this case, we have, as you can see here, very detailed documentation of this process. I think you get the picture. One aspect of my job, preserving virtual worlds as a project, is a reflection of this, I suppose, is you have a lot of these moments when, I call them oh my god moments, when you open up a box or something and you realize what you're going to have to deal with. I showed you the box earlier. I opened it up and there were these audio cassettes in there, so it's sort of, oh my god, we're going to have to deal with microcassettes. Here you see the kind of, again, floppies, various kinds of media formats, all kinds of difficult media objects to deal with in this collection. I started writing more about how the computer game archive of the future might look, and some of the difficulties involved with software preservation. In these papers, gradually a set of goals started to emerge for future projects. these were this is about 10 years ago, let's say 2002, 2003. And it seemed like the way to proceed with game archives, software archives generally, was along the lines that you see in the slide. So building emulation test beds, meaning figuring out how to run historical software, building archives of design documents and so forth. You've seen examples of that already with the 73 Easting collection. Projects have emerged since that time that have taken up on some of these challenges. For example, you may know about the KEEP project, Keeping Emulation Environments Portable in Europe, which is basically an emulation testbed that's been put together by a consortium of libraries and museums in Europe. And this is the emulation framework model for KEEP. A more recent project is the Olive Archive, which is kind of a collaboration of Carnegie Mellon and IBM. This is a little bit different model. It's more around making it easier to execute content on environments that have been preserved as part of Olive, so that according to this model, institutions would have collections that they could then reliably run on a shared resource like Olive. And also, some of our own activities, I mentioned game performance archives. If you take a look at the Machinima Archive or the Preserving Virtual Worlds collection, you'll see what I'm talking about there. This slide here is an example from the last few minutes before the closing of EA Land, which used to be known as The Sims Online, and we were able to get somebody in there as part of the closing party who captured the last 3 hours before this virtual world closed. We now have, I believe, video or screenshots from the closing of 3 different virtual worlds, and when I say that, I mean literally from the closing, from the last minutes. A selected collection from the history of Machinima, which is game-based movie making, is another example of a performance archive. And as I mentioned already, archiving virtual worlds is also in that category. Over the course of the history of designing and building digital games, a lot of different techniques were used, and it wasn't always going into Maya and designing your virtual worlds from scratch in a digital environment, but in many cases it meant bringing out graph paper or drawing yourself or drawing maps yourself, and this is all documented in these collections. This is the Strong Museum in Rochester, New York, which is probably the premier collection nowadays of game-related artifacts. It's in Rochester, New York, but it's definitely worth a visit if you're ever in that area and want to see what's going on in hardware preservation. This area of software preservation is far too big for anybody to think about accomplishing much entirely on their own. And that segues nicely into the beginning of the Preserving Virtual Worlds project, which is the research that we conducted over somehow two-year projects, which somehow managed to take 6 years to complete. So 2 + 2 is 6 in this case. Stanford, the lead institution, which was University of Illinois, University of Maryland, and the Rochester Institute of Technology. And each of those institutions had different specializations and different sets of skills and expertise. Virtual Worlds means 3 different kinds of software. It means interactive literature, text adventures and so forth, a format of the 1980s. It means digital games, and it means virtual worlds a la Second Life, the more unstructured kinds of virtual worlds. And we attempted in the first Preserving Virtual Worlds project, so let's call it Preserving Virtual Worlds 1, we attempted to deal with all 3 formats and go at them from the point of view that very little had been done. There was very little reliable work that a library or museum could point to So we would just try to tackle all of the basic problems around data capture, migration, some description issues from the ground up. Starting from scratch, really, in this area, was to begin to develop some mechanisms for preserving digital games, interactive fiction, virtual world software. As it says up there, we were looking at the issues. We had a set of case studies, 8 pieces of software, the virtual world Second Life, and we basically decided to just run through all the issues we could in the 2 years and develop a detailed report that would make it possible for other institutions to benefit from this work. Part of it, so developing these schemas and ontologies is what makes it possible to represent the data that's collected in a repository at one point. So the University of Illinois team was extremely strong in that area, led by Jerome McDonough, and they did a lot of work on representation and metadata. We then decided to pick up in Preserving Virtual Worlds 2 on one specific concept that seemed very pregnant with possibilities based on the first project, and that was the idea of the concept of significant properties. Significant properties in several areas of digital curation and preservation refers to properties that are used to assess the quality of data migration and emulation, and basically give institutions benchmarks for their success in preservation activities. So, and the significant properties basically refer to what you monitor, the properties of the objects that you monitor in order to judge your success. In this project, we focused on significant properties. We again decided to take kind of a case approach, and we sort of ran into some difficulties with applying that concept to software. Most of the work that had been done, it turned out, had been done with static objects like photographs, and it was very difficult to convert that over to interactive software, because there's two reasons for that. The first reason is it's very difficult for users of software to agree, as we found out in the project, because there's so much happening under the hood with software that sometimes if you just look at what you see or what you hear, you can't be sure if that corresponds to what you were supposed to see or hear. And the current project that's taken up a lot of my time is a project that has been funded by the National Institute for Standards and Technology in Washington, D.C. It is a collaborative project, so that's good, between NIST's National Software Research Lab, that's NSRL, and Stanford. It involves capturing data from the Cabernetti collection software artifacts. We're going to be, I think the basic message here is that we're moving from some of these data capture kind of basic foundational projects that we did in Preserving Virtual Worlds to now getting to the nitty-gritty of managing and providing access to software collections of this type. The issues are different in a significant way. We're pushed, for example, to much more careful attention to metadata schemes that we need to use. How do we catalog the software? How do we make it searchable and findable? And also, eventually, we'll also have to deal with issues around emulation and so forth in order to make the software usable for people. When this is done, we're going to produce images of the data on all of the Cabernetti artifacts. When we do that, we're going to note when we fail. We're going to note every time we're not able to get the data, which will also be a research result, of course, because we'll have reliable failure numbers that aren't based on artificial tests in a lab, but based on actual real-world stuff. Big problem is going to be metadata in all of this. There is a long, for game studies, which is not all that old, there's a pretty long history of arguing about how to describe games and why traditional cataloging formats don't work very well. We will touch on that problem in the NSRL project. Rolling in after the NSRL project, if IMLS decides to fund us, will be this additional activity on game metadata. And that's basically what I wanted to talk about. As you can see, there's quite an arc. Is actually of 15 years of work here that I've just described in 35 minutes.
Thank you very much, Henry.
Okay, you're welcome. Thank you for asking me to come.